with your energy system, that's on me. If you have, we're fighting climate change, that's on me. Banking, insurance, all that sort of stuff. Not really. But before that, in a prior life, was a real-life constitutional lawyer focusing on the First Amendment, among other things. And so it's particularly exciting to be here to talk to you guys a little bit about the intersection between the federal Constitution and the role of the states. And before we do that, just a couple of points worth mentioning. The federal Constitution, as you were just talking about, right, is what's called a sort of limiting document. It's a negative space document. And by that it means it really accomplishes three things. One, it talks about the mechanics of how the federal government works, right? Congress shall be this, you have to be 35 to be president, every 6 years senators get elected, all that sort of stuff are the mechanics of how the federal government's going to work. It talks about the relationship between the federal government and the states, right? The federal government can do this, Congress can regulate interstate commerce, but Congress can't do that, that's reserved to the states, those kind of things. And the third thing it talks about is the relationship between all governments, that is to say, federal, state, and local, and people. Right? The Bill of Rights says you and you and you and you and me all have certain rights that no government can take away from us. Okay? And so what does that mean? We're going to talk a little bit about all the intersection of all three of those. But that last part is actually important because you were just talking about the difference between a democracy and a representative democracy. One word missing from that is, in that discussion, about what our government really is, a republic. Does anyone know what that word means compared to, say, representative democracy? Okay, yes, give it a roll.
A collection of states under, with individual rights under one general governing body.
The second half, it doesn't have to be states, but the second half is right? So in other words, what a republic is, so let me try to illustrate it just for a second. A pure democracy would be, we're deciding today what we're going to talk about, and everybody gets to raise their hand, and the majority carries. Now the problem with that, of course, is in a country as large as this, how can you do any business? And we'd have to vote on everything and debate everything all the time. A representative democracy says we actually vote once in a while to have certain people go and then do the laws and vote for us. A republic, which is what I think you were getting at in the second part, says, okay, that's fine, but there's certain limits on what those folks can do. They can't just go vote and say, you can't speak in public. They can't just go vote and say, you know what, we're going to have a trial by jury for you, but not for you. They can't go and say, we're going to take your house without giving you compensation, which you could do in a pure democracy. And so what makes us a republic, in large part, is how we have a constitution that sets out the three things I just mentioned. Okay? And one more point, which I want to come back to at the end of our discussion, but I don't want to do it now because otherwise I think it'll blow up this whole session, is the role of the Supreme Court in all this, right? We'll get there. The reason, but the reason the Supreme Court is so important, right, is not because we like to fight about it. It's because the Supreme Court gets to decide where the lines are in those three categories. Where is the line between your right as an individual and what the government can and can't do to you? Where is the line between what the federal government can do and states can do? And it's particularly poignant now, right? I work for the governor of the state of New York. He has been, it's fair to say, a not shy opponent of Donald Trump. Trump does something, we announce, hey, we're stepping into that gap, right? Well, where is the line between what authority can be exercised by the federal government versus can be exercised by Governor Cuomo here in New York State? The Supreme Court gets to talk about that. And that is why it's so important. Now, one question, just a little thing of interest before we get on to the stage is, does anyone know, why does the Supreme Court get to be the one that decides where the lines are? Where in the Constitution? You just looked at some language. Where does it say it?
Well, wasn't there a precedent in the 19th century where they decided that, the Supreme Court gets to decide, what...
And the name of that case was?
Oh,
come on, Marbury versus Madison, right? Excellent. So, but here's what's interesting about it, right? So, but the point is, this is what's interesting, because when you think about the Constitution, and particularly the preamble, I know you've been spending your time talking about the preamble is not law. It's just aspirational stuff we talk about in our government. It's not actually law. And so the Constitution has a lot of things that are aspirational, vague, And as you start working in practice, you have to have mechanisms that say, well, okay, that's an interesting idea, but how does this really work? And what's called judicial review, which is the ability of the court to review the constitutionality of things and set lines, is not in the Constitution. It's not there. There is no reason to believe in reading the Constitution that the Supreme Court, as opposed to Congress or the President, be the one who ultimately has the final say on what is and isn't constitutional. But what happened, and for those of you who want to be constitutional law geeks, I'll just send you this way because I think it's interesting. What actually ended up happening is that John Marshall in Marbury versus Madison, who didn't like his cousin Thomas Jefferson, seriously, ruled a case that said the following, because Jefferson was trying to get the courts to do something to stop the midnight judges put by Adams. This might be familiar to some of you who've taken American history. And what Marshall did in a tremendously interesting move is he said, well, it's interesting you gave us that power, but you actually didn't have the power to give us that power. So therefore we don't have that power. Right? So Congress and the President passed a law that gave the courts additional authority beyond the Constitution, and Marshall says, actually, you don't have the authority, it wasn't right for you. You didn't have the right under the Constitution to give us that power. So no thank you to that power. But in doing that, and this is where it gets fun, he took more power. He said, and I'm the guy who gets to say what has power between us by saying no to the power you're giving. So that's Marbury versus Madison, perhaps the most famous case, arguably until Brown versus Board of Education in American history. Okay, so that's what the federal government is about. Now, here's the question that becomes really interesting. We talk about limited government, limited constitutional federal government. Who here believes you have a right to an education? Where does it say that in the Constitution? It does not. So why do you think you have a right? Anyone want to jump in? Yeah. Oh, sorry, back there. Yeah.
I guess that probably falls into general welfare.
So you think you have a federal right to an education? That is to say, if we moved to any state in the country, I'm just playing this out, you would have the same right you think you have now sitting here in New York State.
I hope so, yeah.
Hope so, agreed. Yes?
Does it fall under defense? Because I know in the 60s, Truman made an education act where everyone had to become educated because we were scared that Russian intelligence would become
Ideologically take over kind of thing. Okay, defense. So you're anchoring the preamble, general welfare, defense in the preamble, yeah? Remember, preamble's not law. Okay, just keep that in mind. The preamble of the Constitution is just us getting together and talking about what we want to do. It's not an actual law. Yeah?
Well, maybe not on like a federal level, but on a state level, they have different areas saying that education is really important for us.
Exactly. So, your right to an education in New York State, sitting here now, does not arise from the federal Constitution. There is no federal guarantee, constitutional right, that says you have to have a basic public education paid for by the government. Sorry. But, right? But that's not necessarily a comment on how mean the federal government is or how terrible the Constitution is. The way our system is structured is that the federal Constitution, the federal government, are limited rights. We talked about those three categories. And that leaves space for states, which are more directly connected to people and cities, to decide what are the things we want to affirmatively do. I've been talking about negative space from the federal Constitution as it limits. But states can step in and say, we want to do things affirmatively. We want to provide you with an education. And lo and behold, the New York State Constitution, we'll just put it up here. Article 11. And the New York State Constitution, if you think the federal Constitution is long, spend 2 weeks with the New York State Constitution, because this thing goes on for 100 pages and it has all sorts of stuff. But the one I want to focus on today is education, Article 11. Section 1. This is constitutional in New York State. Has the exact same authority as a federal constitutional within this state provision. Doesn't have any effect in Delaware or Connecticut or New Jersey or Arizona. But in New York State, it is a constitutional right. The legislature shall provide for the maintenance and support of a system of free common schools wherein all the children of this state may be educated. And you can leave aside the parents of it. What does that mean? Anyone want to take a gander? Yeah.
How about a public school fiance?
Yes, and of course the difference between a negative right and an affirmative right becomes clear in a second. You're right, but But if I tell you the government can't interfere with your speech, does that cost the government anything? No. In fact, it saves it money, right? They don't have to bring the police to shut you down. But here, look at the right. It's not just saying that you have a right to go to public school, but what's more, the legislature shall, not if it wants to, maybe, shall provide, that's that word again that we talked about in the preamble, not promote, provide, for the maintenance and support of a system of free common schools. So that means it's a duty, if you're an elected state senator, or an elected state assemblyman, you have an obligation under the Constitution to pass bills that provide this. Now, the next question becomes, where's the money come from? And how does it get distributed? So yeah, you shot your hand up first. You want to start talking about this?
Like taxes?
Yes, taxes. What kind of taxes do we know? You want to go?
Property taxes?
Partially.
Income taxes.
So what funds this, right? Let me just throw out a few questions. A, the money comes in part, education is primarily funded by two sources, right? Local property taxes, so the taxes on the houses in the town where the schools are, let's say, and other buildings, and general state funds, which are primarily done by income taxes. I'll put a chart up in a second to show that. And it's a mix of those two. Now that creates a whole bunch of questions, right? And a whole bunch of problems. Anyone want to take a shot at what those might be?
If you live in an area with higher property taxes, the schools are better funded.
Right, so let's assume that the state gives out of income taxes an even per pupil amount, right? And that's not always the case, but let's assume that's the case for a second. If you live in a town which has higher property values, right, one or two things are true. Either you're generating more money to pay for schools and therefore provide better facilities, teachers, all the rest of it arguably, or your property taxes are lower and therefore it's more affordable to do other things in the property. But yes, the bottom line is it creates a disproportionate effect for wealthier towns can spend more on education. So it creates an unequal distribution, notwithstanding that everybody has to meet this baseline, and the baseline has been judged by courts, it's gone back and forth over years, to be a sound basic education. That means, essentially, you have to be educated enough to be able to make an informed decision when you vote and qualify for a job, is basically what the courts have said. It doesn't have to be calculus, but it has to be a sound basic education is the floor. But where things start to get, that's great that we have a right to education, free education in New York State that's a floor, but where things get very interesting is how do the system of funding it create disparities in the outcomes and the abilities and the access of what it means beyond that floor.